The Independent Transport Commission is a charity formed 10 years ago. It inquires into issues of current transport policy and land use, examines possible solutions to transport problems, publishes reports and recommendations, and promotes public debate. It has a particular interest in the long-term and unintended consequences of transport policy. With no endowment of its own, it relies on grants and donations from trusts and foundations, from industry and from public bodies. This presentation is about a new report on long-distance travel in Britain. It can be found on the ITC website, along with other information about the ITC. The intended audience includes transport planners, policymakers and analysts in government departments and agencies, the transport industries of rail, bus, coach and aviation, as well as academics, researchers and students of transport planning, economics and modelling. I am David Quarmby, a member of the ITC and a former chairman. The ITC published its report on long-distance travel in March 2010, and it can be found on the website independenttransportcommission.org.uk. To those familiar with the transport field, I think it contains some surprises, some things I bet you didn't know, some things that will cause you to think, and maybe some things that will change your mind. The ITC commissioned this study because we believe long-distance travel has been a neglected area of policy. Most of the concern of transport planners and policymakers is about shorter distance, day-to-day travel in towns, cities and metropolitan areas, and that's fair enough as that's where most congestion is. But when people look at longer distance travel, it's usually specific by mode: rail, aviation, and sometimes coach travel. But when did anyone last look at long distance travel by all modes together, like we look at all modes in towns and cities? And there have been some unexpected changes. A 60% rail growth since the mid-90s. Car travel growth, however, has flatlined more recently, and there's been huge domestic aviation growth, but not to Heathrow. Now, what do you think is the most common journey purpose for long-distance travel? Would it be holidays? Business travel? Well, actually not. It's visiting friends and relatives, VFR in the jargon, 28% of journeys. And the next most common journey purpose? It's leisure at 21%, and the one after that, holidays, another 21%. So these three categories, together adding up to 70% of all long-distance travel, are all about personal travel. Business travel is 20%, and the last group, long-distance commuting, that's journeys over 50 miles, is 10%. Well, since the first three categories of personal travel are for journeys over 50 miles, they are in effect tourism, as defined by the international bodies. So, 70% of long-distance travel in Great Britain is domestic tourism. Why is this interesting? Well, because it's very different from day-to-day urban travel. The drivers of long-distance travel are different, and people respond differently to changes in what the networks and modes offer them. And finally, the value to long-distance travellers of improvements to capacity and service are not, in my view, fully captured by the conventional methods of cost-benefit analysis and transport project appraisal. And why is it important? Because although long-distance travel only accounts for 3% of mechanised trips by Great British residents, it accounts for nearly 1/3 of all the mileage travel, and potentially 1/3 of all the carbon emitted by personal travel. Okay, so let's stand back from the sound bites and give you the overall picture. This study was commissioned by the ITC to find out more about long-distance travel, its patterns and its drivers, and what its forecasts look like, and how different policy scenarios might affect those forecasts. The research behind the report was carried out by Professor Joyce Dargay at the Institute for Transport Studies at Leeds University. Her own research report is also on the ITC website, independenttransportcommission.org.uk. Joyce was tasked with developing a model of long-distance travel in Britain by 4 modes: car, rail, air and coach, with the ability to backcast to 1996 and to forecast to 2030. It is a model of aggregate demand, not geographically specific. Her primary data source was the National Travel Survey over 13 years, plus other sources including ITS's own surveys. The Independent Transport Commission is immensely grateful to our core sponsors, Go Ahead, Stagecoach and Arriva, and to our project sponsors for this piece of work, the Department for Transport, the Rhys Jeffreys Road Fund and Network Rail. Thanks of course also to the group of ITC members who helped me manage this study through: Mary Boner, Peter Jones and latterly Elizabeth Gilliard. Thanks of course to Joyce Dargay, and last but not least to Terence Bendixson, who as Secretary to the ITC provided immense support, negotiated with Leeds University, got the finance organised and ensured that the report would be readable and got printed. We're going to look at 3 things in more detail. First, the overall patterns of long-distance travel. Then, the drivers of long-distance travel and what influences people's decisions. Finally, some future scenarios and forecasts. With data from the National Travel Survey, this table tells us the basics. One-way trips of over 50 miles per person in a year, averaged for the middle of the decade. 20 one-way trips per annum, with an average of about 100 miles, travelling in total over 2,000 miles. And although only 3% of all mechanised trips, these long-distance trips account for over 30% of all travel mileage. That is the pattern for car use too, 3% of trips, but nearly 30% of all travel mileage by car. It's different for rail, with 15% of rail journeys over 50 miles and representing over half of all travel mileage by rail. Now this may be a surprise. 78% of all long-distance travel is by car, 12% by rail, 6% by coach and 4% by air. Again, don't forget this is domestic air travel only. Long-distance travel has been growing over the last 10 to 12 years, but in recent years the growth in car travel seems to have flattened out, while rail has continued to grow. Although domestic air travel has a small share, 4% of all long-distance travel, it has grown considerably over this period. And interestingly, routes have grown up not so much to compete with rail, except over 300 miles, but to cover routes for which there's no satisfactory or fast rail option, as this table of destinations reached from selected airports shows, and many of them are providing for cross-country journeys. This is the analysis of journey purposes I mentioned at the beginning. The 3 categories of tourism travel, leisure, then holidays, and visiting friends and relatives, VFR, have grown over this period and now account for 70% of all long-distance travel, with business at 20% and commuting at 10%. This table shows the shares that each mode has of the 5 different journey purposes. Read across the table following the arrows. So, for example, for business travel over 50 miles, 75% of it is by car, 13% by rail, 2% by coach, and 10% by domestic air. The green column at the end on the right reminds you of the relative importance of the different journey purposes. Well, as you can see, the car is dominant for all journey purposes, especially VFR. It's dominant even for long-distance commuting, with rail picking up the balance of nearly a quarter. Coach takes a reasonable share only of holiday and leisure travel.